Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello, welcome, everyone. We're going to get started pretty shortly. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining, everyone. If people want to introduce themselves in the chat and say where you're calling from, which site you're affiliated, if you're affiliated with the site, we'd love to get to know who all's here right now. Welcome. Hey, Les. Good morning. Good morning, Ebony. Hi, Lori, calling in from Coast Plaza. Greetings, BC, calling from UC Irvine. We have Sri calling in from Walnut Creek. We have Brad calling in from Minnesota. Welcome. Hi, Steve, calling from Illinois. I know it's the afternoon if you're calling in from the Midwest or the East Coast. We have Josh from Sharp in San Diego. Wow, we have quite a bit of people today. Welcome. Good afternoon. We're going to get started and test a little bit. Reminder, if you want to let everyone know in the chat what you're saying, be sure to click or select panelists and attendees. That way everyone in the room can see who's writing in the chat. Oh, hey, Megan. Thanks so much for joining. Megan's calling in from Kansas. Hello, James, calling in from UCLA, Harbor, UCLA. Yes, Arya, I am also originally from Kansas. Well, greetings, everyone. Okay, we're going to get started. So my name is John. I'm a program associate with California Bridge, and I am really excited to have all of you here today. This is our boot camp for change makers. This is session 7, where we're going to be going over advanced buprenorphine with our guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Herring. Andrew is one of the directors for California Bridge, as well as an emergency medicine physician at Highland General Hospital in Oakland, California. And Andrew has been a major pioneer with buprenorphine in the emergency department. And so we're really excited to have him here today to share about using advanced buprenorphine techniques and hopefully inform you all in your practice as well as clinicians. So before we do that, some quick housekeeping. Just so everyone knows, there are closed captions at the bottom. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can click closed captioning if you want to be able to read what's being said. And then another reminder that if you want to share something with both the panelists and the attendees, to be able to select that in the Zoom chat feature. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Andrew and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. I'm super pumped to be here. We can sort of talk about really get into the nitty gritty of buprenorphine and focusing on what I'm actually doing right now. So let's get started. Drug users make rational decisions, but doctors don't. This is just so true. And this is why I love this field so much, because what I'm really seeing is the way I learn is by really trying to get inside the head of people that are rationally using substances, for reward and for other things, and figure out the logic, because there is this real history of, of thinking that drug use is this irrational, crazy thing that people do, that when in fact we are just neurobiological animals that have a vulnerability to rewarding substances. We have since before we were humans, when we were apes, and we will forever. It's just how we're built. But what we did is culturally, we put on all of these bonkers, ideas about what is appropriate, addiction treatment, around rules, and we have to deal with the DEA in our medical practice. Are you kidding me? Like, cops are going to tell me what I can and can't do to treat addiction? It's totally insane. So hopefully that this is sort of a historical moment that will change. And I think all of us really need to think about what the role of criminalization is, in the lives of the patients we're trying to help. And I would say for the most part, it's incredibly negative. So I want to get policing out of the treatment business. So that's just something to think about as a physician. For us, right, this is Highland in 1989, right? And this is a good example of what I consider just sort of insanity, not on the part of patients, but on the part of doctors, right? It was just this dehumanizing, racialized idea of just, urban decline, madness, it's just a joke, really. And it was very cruel, right? So this is where we were in 1989. And this is where we are right now in 2018, the same hospital, the same newspaper. Look how everything is framed differently. Now it's this sort of compassionate, the little fluffy dog on a bed, and it's talking about treatment on demand, being receptive to patients, working collaboratively. This is the future, right? So we're coming out of a dark future, but we've got coming out of a dark past into a really bright and exciting future that begins with partnership with people using drugs and using our brains and tools as doctors to help them along the way. So a little bit about me. How do I know what I'm going to talk to you about? Because I think it's really important, when someone's talking about treating, you got to make sure they actually do the work, and I think that I'm incredibly fortunate because I have the bridge, right? So we've got, first 1, then 2, then 12, then 52, now expanding nearly 90, maybe 200 in this near future. And so I really rely on that group of people that when things go well, things go wrong, they filter it through the bridge. So I find out about it. So I've got an experience through both directly at Highland and through the bridge, really literally thousands of buprenorphine inductions. In our initial pilot of 14 months or so, we identified 12,000 people. There were over 7,000 inductions, right? So, we've got some experience here that we can translate into innovation and better practice. Okay, the other piece that really adds to my experience, which I really rely on a lot, is participation in formal National Institute of Health funded research, where it's totally different than regular practice, but it gives you a chance to form like an observation window and really observe, like, what does it mean to take someone off the street and give them buprenorphine? What happens to them at minute 15, at minute 30, at minute 60, at minute 90, at 2 hours, 3 days, and you have like millions of dollars to pay people to observe and document and review. So this has got nearly 30 sites around the country. I'm primarily in charge, or not in charge, but I'm helping the Western sites, but I'm involved with, a bad case, there's precipitated withdrawal with any of these sites, my cell phone goes off. So, and I also have these incredible colleagues from Gail D'Onofrio to Jean Marie Perrone and Sharon Walsh and Ryan McCormick and all these other folks who can kind of call me out on their experience. Is it different than what we're seeing in California? They have different perspective on dosing and timing and all these kind of things. So it's an incredibly rich background. Finally, I have a huge number of substance use navigators that really walk in patients' shoes, and they are a huge check. Like, dude, you did that prescription, you did that dose. They went home and they felt awful, right? So I follow people for not just days or weeks, but years. So through this network of substance use navigators, it's just a huge part of my life. Okay, finally is the staff that we've all worked with at Highland. We've been doing this for years. Basically got started in 2017. So thousands of inductions down the road and a lot of really good clinicians also giving me feedback. So basic resources for you guys. I think this paper stands up well. This is a paper I wrote with two toxicologists, Jean Marie Perron and Louis Nelson, for the Annals of Emergency Medicine. You know that there are lots of changes since then, but really I think the fundamentals are pretty good in this paper, so I would definitely recommend checking it out. This paper is about to come out in JAMA. It's high dose buprenorphine in the emergency department. It basically just is the first paper to really show it's safe. You can do big doses. You don't have to be bound by tiny little doses like 4 and 8, that kind of thing. So there's hundreds of patients who got 32 milligrams or 24 milligrams, and take home point, newsflash, they all did great. This is a paper on buprenorphine after overdose, which also encapsulates some of my more complicated thinking about pharmacology. I wrote this with Mark Greenwald, who is just an incredible mentor and pharmacologist at Wayne State. He's really the shining light about understanding buprenorphine and pharmacokinetics and things. Finally, the CA Bridge website, which is the encapsulation, the distilled, like, okay, rubber meets the road, this is what you should do. So those are, you're looking for background resources, that is where you should go. For looking forward, kind of like next steps, this is a highlandbridge.org/ECP. This is all beta. So you got to understand that every single thing up here might be wrong, right? So this is basically, what am I thinking forward about? What am I interested in other people tinkering with? And it's all here. So feel free to download it, all that stuff, but just understand, I can't really vet it. This is just sort of the X project of what might be coming down the route. But feel free to download all this stuff and kind of think about where things might be going. All right, take home. How do you successfully induce someone onto buprenorphine? First thing is you got to be nice, right? It's not a soft skill. It's a hard skill in the sense that a withdrawal is so subjective. So the potency, the effect size of placebo when you're coping with withdrawal is absolutely enormous. In previous epochs of research would probably be almost unethical at this point. They've done whole detoxification protocols where they randomized people to methadone or placebo. They thought they were getting methadone, and they detoxified off of opioid with pure placebo. So the emotional component of withdrawal is enormous. So if you are stressed out, if you are, inflexible, if you are all these things, they're going to be stressed out and inflexible and worried and all this kind of stuff. So be nice, be confident, project that, hey, you're going to do great, and it's going to take you a long way. Now, what if they don't want your damn treatment, right? If they don't want your dumb buprenorphine, you're not a bup doctor. You care about them as a human being, and you've got many tools. So if they don't want your buprenorphine, if they don't want your methadone, you're not done, right? You care about them. So hepatitis C screening and treatment, HIV screening and treatment, interpersonal violence, mental health, suicide screening, lethal means counseling. All this stuff is a big, huge package. In addition to, right? If they're using needles, give them clean needles, safe cooking kits. If they're smoking meth, clean, smoking kits that don't burn their lips, like all of that stuff that harm reductionists have been doing on the street, volunteering for years, doing is the right thing to do, that we all should do. This division between medical practice and harm reduction is totally silly, and we need to break it down. So we all need to be harm reductionists. Okay, the trajectories of people on BUP. The point here, there is no single interaction that is like the pivot point where everything depends about like what happened during this ED visit. I know that I've bought into this mentality where it's like, okay, I am going to put on my hero cape and I'm going to do everything for this person. I am going to save them. I'm going to do this crazy stuff and stay, hours after my shift to make sure. A little bit of that is just kind of sort of narcissistic and just not real, right? This is a long-term, relapsing, remitting, complicated disorder. So any one experience, whether it's really good or really bad, honestly isn't going to change everything. So if you Don't be disappointed if you give someone the most amazing induction experience ever. Like it's just perfect, you know, like unicorns and rainbows, and it's just like hugs. And don't be surprised if next week that person goes back to using fentanyl, right? Don't take it personally. The same way is if you totally screw this up, right? You're like, oh God, you know, they feel terrible. They vomit on your shoes. They leave AMA. Don't be like, oh my God, you know, they are going to die because of my bad induction. That's not true. So get the long view, right? The thing that you want to do is you want to be nice, be courteous, and try to offer belonging. This sense that you know that you are part of their community, that you want to be friends with them, whether or not they're using, whether or not their treatment worked, that it's not this contingent upon their behavior or compliance with your treatment thing, that you're there with them in the long haul, right? And all this other stuff will wash out. All right. Also recognize that once they leave the ER, they are entering this tragically fragmented, hostile system. It's like you can't make this stuff up, right? Like you have this fatal disease, and then you make all of these friction points and barriers and pitfalls. It's just silly, but it's the truth. So again, you could do the most amazing job ever in the clinic, in the ER, and then they go to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist is rude and says they don't have a valid ID, and they start withdrawing, and they go back to the street. This is the very glamorous reality of recovery, right? It's not like hugs and all this kind of stuff. It's like, oh God, it's waiting in line to get your prescription. It's dealing with insurance. It's dealing with, you know, financial counseling, all this stuff, right? That has nothing to do with buprenorphine dosing protocols. So just remember that. Okay, big picture is history being written, and it's ugly. We are basically living in the worst case scenario. Like it could not have gone worse, right? So basically, you know, in the 1990s, you have this absolutely awful profiteering that occurs. So this unprecedented exposure to the US population to opioids driven by greed primarily, right? So McKesson, Purdue, Lilly, all of them, right? Walgreens, you know, everyone's in bed on this, and they made billions of dollars, and they exposed just this huge swath of the population to opioid that in no time in history had ever been exposed at such a level. And then they dragged their feet on regulation. We knew this was a problem, right? You know, late 2000s, it's like, oh, geez, something is going wrong. Just delay. And so it wasn't until like 2012 that we really start meaningfully restricting. So we have this unprecedented and sustained exposure to opioid. So you create a cohort of people dependent on opioids. And then we take this huge gambit, this big gamble, like, okay, what if we take thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people that are dependent on opioid and we just cut them off, right? Maybe they'll just kick on their own and their use disorder will go away, right? You know, there is a universe when that could have happened, but it didn't. And in fact, it was so awful. They didn't just go from medical opioids to street opioid pills. This happened to coincide with the maturation and professionalization of these international criminal networks. So they just ramped up production of heroin. And then when that was too difficult, they did the worst case scenario possible. They ramped up production of fentanyl. So we have now this enormous group of people that are going from opioids, medically prescribed exposure, either through prescription or diversion of prescription. At some level, it traces back to us, right? Who then move on to fentanyl. People are not moving into the cohort of opioid dependent people attracted by fentanyl. That doesn't happen. People are brought in through these other opioids and then transferred to fentanyl because it's a cheaper, more available option. This is the worst case scenario, right? Which we are all culpable for. Okay. That's why this is so freaking important, right? This is a big deal. This is, you know, right now, this is something that your hospital should be spending millions of dollars on. And I can almost assure you they're not, right? So the message to your board of trustees, to your CMO, to your CEO is this is a fire that is out of control, and it is being treated with this fraction of the resources with which it deserves. So let's get into the nitty gritty. All right. So what do you do? How do you actually treat people? Evaluation. Well, first thing, cows. Cows, you know, Wesson and Walter Ling. Walter Ling was an early mentor of mine, an amazing guy. And he's the first thing to tell you, this was not designed to determine if someone was appropriate for buprenorphine treatment in pragmatic clinical practice. No, right? This was designed as a research tool. I use cows a lot in research, right? And in research, it's a big problem because the inter-rater reliability is so bad, right? So whether my cows and the nurse's cows and your cows, they could be widely divergent, right? It has 11 dimensions with each dimension being scored, you know, with 4, you know, points. It's not clinically applicable, really, right? You can do it. But the main thing is if you compare it to just how sick do you feel from withdrawals? The curves are exactly the same. This is Andy Tompkins over at UCSF, who did this nice study where he literally takes people who are on opioids, he administers naloxone, induces withdrawals, and then he compares cow scores, you know, subjective opioid withdrawal scores, and just a unidimensional single question, how sick do you feel from withdrawal? The curve is the same. So basically, you know, this traditional appropriate state to initiate buprenorphine is if you feel very sick from withdrawals, right? If you don't feel sick from withdrawals, you're not ready to start buprenorphine and you don't need to, right? And if you're but if you endorse like, yeah, I feel bad, and that is correlated with just common sense, you know, it's going to be 6 hours since your last use. People aren't going to be very sick in less than 6 hours from their last use. It's just, there's something else going on there if they claim that. And then if they're feeling sick, and it should correlate with objective symptoms, right? They should have sweat in their brow. Their pupils should be a little bit big. They should be a little bit activated. You know, they might have stomach cramping and body aches and anxiety, all these kinds of things. And it's important to know that, right? So the cows is important to know what those are as a heuristic, a learning tool for the symptoms and experiences of opioid withdrawal, because very good people rationally might be kind of seduced into deceiving you in the clinical moment because there's something they need. You know, they need to get the buprenorphine because they need to be able to sell it so that they can, you know, get their car, you know, out of impound so they can drive and pick up their kid, or, you know, who knows what, right? So there could be very good people can use medical interactions for secondary gain, and it's no judgment, it's just reality. Okay, so treatment. You decided someone is going to need buprenorphine and they're ready to go. This is what I do. I basically either do a patient-directed loading dose, I do what I call micro-macro, or I do an injectable Bup start. So we're going to go over each one of these things. So the patient-directed loading dose, I love this. This is called the Subway menu. So this is what we use at Highland. We've been using it for years. It basically takes into account that not all opioid users are equal. It's just, again, insane, right? So some people use a tiny bit of Norco and other people are injecting 3 to 4 grams of fentanyl a day. The idea that they should be treated the same is totally bonkers, right? It's just not the way buprenorphine or opioid pharmacology works. So how are you going to find out if someone has a high tolerance or low tolerance? You just have to ask them. People know. So what I typically do is just sit down with people and say, okay, you know, here's what's going to happen. Lay out the menu, you know, just like you're at a restaurant or an amusement park. It's respectful, you know, like this idea that patients should just be like subjugated and doing exactly what you say without understanding the big picture is ridiculous. Let them know what's going to happen because you want to recruit them to participate with you to make this a successful adventure together. So the nurse is going to bring you buprenorphine. We're going to get you treated as quickly as possible. You do this before you do intakes, before you do financial counseling, before you figure out, like, do they use methamphetamine? Do they use, you know, do they have like a family history of this? You don't need to do all that stuff. What you need to do is make them feel better as quickly as possible. Everything else happens later, right? So first thing, let's get you feeling better. And then we're going to talk more about where this is going long-term and the more details. In terms of what you start with, if you're just a regular heroin user or morphine or pill user, right? You just talk about it. If you consider yourself a heavy user, right? I would suggest starting with 16 milligrams. If you're using 3 Norco 5s a day, then you're a light user and you can start with 4 or 8 and you really just walk them through it. Some people really want the hammer, like they're like, oh my God, I feel so terrible. I just want you to take this away. I just want it all to go away no matter what. Other people are really kind of scared of medical control, being overly sedated, all that stuff, being quote unquote hooked on another drug. And even though they have a huge habit, they're injecting 2 grams a day, they still want a little dose, and that's fine. So it's up to them. So then they get their first dose. You say, okay, all right, you're going to feel better. I'm going to come back in 30 minutes or 15 minutes. Put the positive perception in their mind, and you come back, and then here's the top off dose. In general, if you're feeling better, there's the best thing to do is to give them more. Like in the ER, you kind of want to get as much buprenorphine as you can into people, because when they leave, God knows what's going to happen. Is their insurance, valid? Do they have a pharmacy set up? All that kind of thing. But it's not a requirement. If they're like, no, I'm good. I know where I'm going to follow up. I feel good now. Last thing I want to do is get more sedated or maybe have some nausea. So no, they don't need to. But I definitely offer, like, hey, if you're unsure, you're not sure how this is going to go, the more you get, the more you're going to have a day or two. It'll extend out the reduction in craving, protection from overdose, and withdrawal suppression. So that's basically how I do it 80% of the time. Micro macro. So this is for the person who is not in withdrawal, right? So they're standing in front of you, and it'll be like me, like, hey, I want to start on Bup. And you look at them and they're like just looking fine. You're like, okay, when was your last use? Like, well, I used like an hour ago. I feel fine, but I'm really ready. I'm working right now. So it's hard for me to take time off to get started on Bup, but I'm kind of afraid about the withdrawals, that kind of thing. So what I do is I give, at that point in time, before they enter withdrawal, you can administer a very small amount of buprenorphine. This sort of idea of an innocuous dose has long been understood with buprenorphine pharmacology. You will not precipitate withdrawal with 0.5 milligram of Bup, right? In most people, you won't precipitate withdrawal with 1 or even 2 milligrams, right? But you can really be sure when you're in that sub-milligram zone. At that point, buprenorphine is fascinating because it is a partial agonist, meaning that it has attenuated downstream signaling once it attaches to the opioid receptor. But it's a partial agonist, but it's also very high potency. So what does that mean? So basically what that means is that buprenorphine exerts its effects at very low concentrations. It's a crazy drug, right? So it means that you can get a strong effect at these microgram doses. That's experienced as low doses generally prevent the development of severe withdrawal, right? You still crave right? You really crave, right? It doesn't fix craving, right? You still are really vulnerable to overdose. It doesn't protect you, doesn't create blockade, but it'll keep you from diarrhea, vomiting, diaphoresis, all of that. So you can do this by different means. My favorite mean is to use a Butrans patch. So I put on 2 20 microgram Butrans patches. I document for pain, long story, but that's what you should do. And then I say, stop using, use the Butrans patch to support you while during your abstinent phase. Drag that on as long as you can. If you can get out to 12 hours or 24 hours, the better. Just really try to drag that out. If you don't have Butrans, you can swallow a 2 milligram tablet. You get about 10% of the IV or about 1/3 of the sublingual dosage if you just swallow it. You do that, every 3 to 4 hours as you're going through abstinence. Don't be tempted to go up. Just let it go. Let it all wash out. Or finally, people are used to like snipping up patches and stuff, so it's not a big deal. So you just, you half it and you quarter it and you eighth it, and you get down to the 0.5 milligram, and you do that every couple hours. Again, do that for a day. And then once you're there, once everything's washed out, you go from the tiny dose to a full dose. Don't be tempted to like baby dose it once you're in withdrawal, you know, because once you're in withdrawal, it's all washed out. You want the full benefit of BUP. So go right to 16. So that's what I call micro macro. Finally, injectable starts. Injectables are absolutely fantastic. I cannot emphasize how positive these are for people's lives. You know, we've been treating literally thousands of patients since 2017. So I've seen multiple cases of people who, you know, they're in a rough situation and they come to the ER and they try to start on BUP and sublingual and they fail. They come back and they fail. They come back and they fail. We've got our substance use navigator team. We hang in there with them, non-judgmental, meet them where they're at, no big deal, but we just observe. This is not working for you. Then finally they come back in and they take the extended release buprenorphine, which lasts for either a month, you know, or 7 days, and they finally do well after struggling for years. I've seen it with my own eyes. I'm a real believer. What is this stuff? It's basically a goo. It's this syrup that is compounded with a fancy set of chemicals that create a chemical reaction between the water content of the subcutaneous fat to create a husk. So it's like a gobstopper. So, and it basically the shell turns hard and it hides the little, you know, the little soft center of BUP, and then gradually elutes, you know, dissolves off the edge. So that the amount of BUP that you get into your bloodstream is proportionate to the three-dimensional surface area of a sphere, which I think is cubed, right? So that means that if you have a big dose like Sublocade, which is produced by Indivior, which is the starting dose is 300 milligrams, it actually comes on really fast. So if someone is in a good case would be someone's in withdrawal, you know, they feel bad. They have a history of taking buprenorphine. That means they, you know, they don't turn purple or have some hypersensitivity reaction or whatever. You know, they use a lot of drugs. So they use, you know, a gram of heroin a day, or they're, you know, whatever, you know, 500 or 600 of oxy a day, something substantial. That's a perfect person. The FDA guidance is to do 7-day lead-in of BUP, right? Which you certainly can, no problem there. But basically everyone who does this, eventually you get this chaotic pattern where people come in and they clearly do fine with buprenorphine, you know, and they clearly have a high tolerance. And it just feels silly to do this 7-day lead-in thing, you know, which you should do if someone's buprenorphine naive and you don't really know their tolerance, do a lead-in. But if they don't, you can start them off with a Sublocade, no problem. If you're worried about it, start with 100 milligrams instead of 300. Now, so this is very applicable to ER practice. Insurance barriers, all these things besides the pharmacology are make this difficult, but it's certainly something that we've been able to kind of work around in a complex way at Highland, and so we definitely do. So if I had my druthers, I would really start everyone on extended release as their first dose. I think it's far superior to the sublingual, because it's basically you're punching your ticket. You're on the train. You're on the treatment train. Things go well. Things go badly. It doesn't. You don't get just knocked off so easily. CAM 2038 is a 24 milligram 7-day version of that. It's produced by Braeburn. It's under review by the FDA right now as we're speaking, and will probably be, you know, approved. So that is the one that's being marketed to ER. I would go for it. I would go to your Medicaid medical director. I would go to your public health director. I would go anyone who will accept, you know, any door you can knock on and say, this should be on our formulary, because it is a game changer for emergency medicine. 7 days, it's easy to administer, they do well, and it just extends the power of that interaction in the ER. Okay, so a little background like on, you know, these different ideas. So big dose, little dose, tiny doses, you know, the idea of the micro macro. So if you've got a lot of heroin, you've basically got a big lightning bolt of opiate signal. And so if you've got a little antagonist, you know, partial agonist reaction in there, like a little microdose, it doesn't mean anything. The sum total signal of opioid is big. If you give them this middling dose, like this 4 milligrams to someone who's got a little bit of heroin, but not a lot, all it does is it cancels out the agonist, the fentanyl, the heroin, but it doesn't provide a replacement signal. So this is the zone that we're seeing most of the precipitated withdrawal, right? Then In the bigger dose, if you just go 16, you definitely block out the heroin, but you also provide a replacement dose that's sufficient so they actually feel well and there's a positive opioid balance. So this is another way of looking at it. It's just sort of this Goldilocks dose, right? If you just give them a tad, they don't notice. So that's micro. Give them this middling dose of 4, it displaces but doesn't replace. You give them the big dose or the macro dose, it displaces and overcomes the opioid deficit. So again, this is really saying the same thing. There's this balance, displacement, blockade, absence, dependency, and you put it all together for your strategies. And that's how I think about and how I arrived at these various strategies I've just talked about. Background pharmacology, sublingual buprenorphine comes in really fast and it goes out really fast because it's a long-acting drug, but you should just know that the peak is really in that first 60 to 90 minutes. This is relevant for you as an ER doc because that's when the things go wrong, right? If you are going to have respiratory depression, if you are going to have, a precipitated withdrawal, it's going to happen in the first 1 to 2 hours. So feel confident that after you've gotten out of that period, things aren't going to go wrong when they go home or things like that. It's just sort of a basic thing to know. The ceiling effect is incredibly strong, right? So Sharon Walsh, someone I work with a lot, she did these seminal series of studies where she just gave, volunteers, these people had been opiate experienced in the past, but were not opiate dependent. So like, you or me or whatever, and gave them, check this out, gave them 32 milligrams, right? Like, imagine I just took 32 milligrams right now. Turned out that the experience here, the little dotted line at 32 milligrams was no different in terms of like how much they felt the drug than the 8 milligram tablet. So this idea that, the big dose is really that different from the patient level in terms of risk than the standard dosing is just not backed up by science. And if you really don't believe me, check this article out. It's by this Dr. Ahmadi. Iran's fascinating. So Tehran has this huge buprenorphine treatment program. And so this was his case report where he gave someone 120 milligrams, right? And they did fine. So I'm not saying you should do that, but just don't be too bent out of shape about 16 if someone's giving 120. Okay. I could talk about microdosing, but microdosing is really for inpatient medicine, or if you're a pain specialist and you're combining prescription of full agonist with prescription of buprenorphine. I really don't support this as something where you're encouraging or endorsing that someone continue to use fentanyl or whatever on the outpatient and then escalate the BUP. I really think that if you're going to do a microdose strategy in the outpatient, you should take on the risk and prescribe them morphine, right? So document pain and prescribe them both. That's my opinion. Okay, so let's do some cases and wrap up. So this is a 32-year-old man who is found by paramedics. We have an incredible paramedics. We have 60 trucks with buprenorphine on them in Contra Costa County. So that means that they are sanctioned to administer buprenorphine in the field, either for withdrawal from abstinence or withdrawal from naloxone. So 32-year-old man, he gets 4 milligrams of intranasal naloxone. He is upset, but he's not agitated or delirious. He's got, runny nose and diaphoresis. And he's feeling bad. And the paramedic calls you and says, what should I do? Right. So the protocol is 16 milligrams. The 16 milligrams under the tongue. Make sure that they dissolve. They don't swallow it. It's really easy to do in these kind of more high intensity cases. And the patients do great, right? The naloxone has some property where basically it just strips all the opioid off. It rapidly induces renewed receptor sensitivity, right? And then buprenorphine has a higher affinity than naloxone for the receptor. So it both creates sensitivity and it sort of facilitates preferential binding of buprenorphine on the receptor versus the competing full agonist, fentanyl or methadone or whatever it is. So now I said methadone. This is not for methadone, right? Overdose for methadone is observe and get back onto methadone. This is purely for heroin or fentanyl. Okay, abscess. So we see these all the time, right? So you get a shooter's abscess. Is this a time for induction? Absolutely, right? So on the Bridge website, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff you can do. This is kind of fun. You just sort of throw the kitchen sink at them, and the elephant in the room, the big The big gun is ketamine. Ketamine is I could give a whole lecture on ketamine and opioids. It is lock and key. It is just perfect. Everything that opioids do that it's bad, hyperalgesia, tolerance, desensitization of receptors is reversed. Depression is reversed by ketamine. So it's not about sedating them so they don't notice the withdrawal. No, it's ketamine very actively treats withdrawal. So you can, if someone also has a pain condition, you kind of a green light. Give that person ketamine, put them on a ketamine drip and induce them onto buprenorphine and wrap it all into one big thing. That's a whole lecture right there, but it's something I love doing. Micro macro we talked about, right? So this is just, would be a 30-something woman, comes in, she's not in any withdrawals. She's been using heroin with the occasional oxy. And she's, she also has a job, as running or as a manager at a local sports gym, and you want to get her started. So what you either put on 2 patches, the 40 micrograms right as you're talking, and then you give the prescription for start 16 milligrams the next morning, or, really as long as you can go, 12 hours, 24 hours preferential, and then 16 milligrams a day until she follows up in care. And that's it. If you don't have transdermal buprenorphine, you just say, okay, here, I'm going to give you 2 milligram tablets. I want you to swallow 1 tablet every 4 hours, until you've been able to go 12 or 24 hours or even longer, and then just go ahead and take 16. And that's micro macro. XR-Bup, this is Sublingual, which is available now. It's going to be an ambulatory drug, so you're going to have a partnership with the bridge clinics. You order it as the ambulatory, but then you can administer it in the ED, because the ED is outpatient, but it's probably hard to order it. You can't order it as a drug from the ED, so it gets a little administratively complicated, but you figure all that stuff out. You've got a guy, he's a heavy fentanyl user. He was on buprenorphine a year ago at 24 to 32 milligrams. He's fallen off. He's been smoking 1 to 2 grams of fentanyl since. He's had several overdoses. And his last use was 3 days ago, right? It's been a while, and he's uncomfortable in front of you, and he's determined to start. You give 300 milligrams subcutaneous under the skin, and he follows up in clinic. That's it. That's the induction strategy. Bonus, precipitated withdrawal. This is something that is coming up, a lot now with fentanyl. And the reason is that fentanyl is what you call a high efficacy agonist. That means when it attaches onto an opioid receptor, it induces desensitization and intracellular downregulation of the signal. So those things that do that create this poverty environment where there's just not enough receptors that work well for buprenorphine to act. So it's like effectively like kryptonite for buprenorphine. So we're seeing some precipitated withdrawal reactions with it. But it's very variable, and it's certainly not every time. I just did a great big dose induction with a fentanyl user yesterday. It works great. So, but sometimes it gets a little rough. The key thing, as soon as you recognize precipitated withdrawal, don't mess around with clonidine. Don't mess around with Zofran and loperamide, all this stuff, right? That's for like mild. Once you've got real withdrawal, like they look bad because they've taken buprenorphine, you got to get going. And what you do is 16 milligrams of buprenorphine and 2 milligrams of lorazepam PO. 16 and 2, nothing else. You do that as soon as possible. Don't perseverate, don't consult, don't what do I do? Just 16 and 2, that's it, right? That's your goal within 30 minutes, right, of recognizing the syndrome. After that, okay, do whatever you want, but that's the key thing. It's my hypothesis that if you do this, you're going to prevent these truly fulminant cases that just sort of spiral this cascading intensity and end up, in the ICU and intubated and all this kind of crazy stuff. I just never seen that if you aggressively treat it up front with benzo for the anxiety, distress, sort of delirium spectrum piece of it, and then 16 to get a solid agonist dose into them. And just so you know, this is the approach that we're now using in this giant trial. We got 30 sites trying it. This is kind of what we all landed. The consensus is just to be simple, 16 of buprenorphine with a little benzo. Okay, so we're just about at time. I really appreciate the opportunity here to talk about all this stuff. I'd love to hear questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew. This has been so helpful. We have a lot of questions in the chat, so I've been compiling them and I can get us started. So Lee Trope asked, we've had a lot of early withdrawal under 10 hours with fentanyl. Is it safe to give high dose buprenorphine so soon?
Early withdrawal with fentanyl. So I would say yes. So basically how I'm operating right now is that I am not treating fentanyl differently. Now, there are definitely some physicians who are. I practice primarily in California. We do see a lot of fentanyl, but what is called fentanyl is really different. Fentanyl from, the websites versus fentanyl from the street, fentanyl in Philadelphia versus fentanyl in Camden, New Jersey versus fentanyl in San Francisco. It's a little different. So, if don't blame me if something goes wrong. But basically, I tell you right now, I'm not practicing differently. So if someone is in front of me and they state that they feel very sick from withdrawal, they've got at least 6 hours, they've got cooperating objective symptoms, pupils, sweats, yawns, all that stuff, I treat them just the same. And so I would do that. I would do the Subway menu. I'd go through like, okay, you're a heavy user. I'd probably recommend you go big, so start with 16. If I had any doubt, if I was like, this is not fitting, they say they're in withdrawal, but they're like, I'm in severe withdrawal, but they're not anxious. They don't have objective signs. There's something off. I'd be like, why don't we just place a patch, right? Let's just place a patch and we'll do micro. So we'll put the patch on, or we'll have you swallow the pills for another day and really get you into clinical clarity. So you just let the abstinence progress till it's really clearly withdrawal, and then go macro.
Great. Thank you. So Thomas asks if you can share more about light, moderate, and heavy doses when it comes to grams a patient is using of heroin or fentanyl. He said, in other words, I don't really know what 2 grams of heroin actually means.
Yeah, right. This has been really fun, is that, now, hundreds, thousands of patients, I just ask them, hey, would you say that you're a light, medium, or heavy user? And they tell me, they'll say, okay, I'm a light user, man, or, yeah, I'm kind of in the middle, or like, I'm a heavy user. And then I asked, hey, so in the worst day, your heaviest use day ever in your entire life, what's the most opioid you've ever used? And I like that question because it's like a power lifter. You don't ask the power lifter, like, how many push-ups did you do this morning? You ask the power lifter, how much can you bench press? And that's going to tell you how strong they are. So that maximum dose really gives me a sense for their true tolerance underlying this. And I have found excellent reliability there, is that basically people who describe themselves as heavy users are typically heavy users. And in California, that usually means you're snorting 1, 2, 3, 4 grams a day. You're injecting, 1, 2, 3, 4 grams a day, or you're on at least a gram a day of fentanyl. Right. And a medium user means you're in that like half gram snorting, half gram injecting, or, like 4 or 5, oxy 30s, that kind of thing. And a light user would be, 3, 4 Norco 10s a day.
Great, thank you, Andrew. We're going to do a couple more questions. We do send out a post-event email, so we can also follow up on some of these other questions in our post-event communication. So we're going to do a couple more questions for today, though. One question is, does a physician need the Data 2000 waiver for the 1-week injectable? Are you aware of that?
It hasn't been decided because it's an under FDA approval. You certainly do for Sublingual. So then I would counter back is, you should have your waiver, right? Because you don't even need to do the damn training. So all you got to do is go to the SAMHSA website and say, I intend to treat people with buprenorphine, and they'll send you an X waiver. So that question is much less relevant.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, another question from Lee. Is there a minimum amount of time that should have passed before it is safe to give buprenorphine, or is it okay with someone who's in withdrawal? We've had a few patients at the 6 to 8 hours and have been nervous about this.
Yeah, it's, it's a great question. So 6 hours, I think, should be fine. Now, it's interesting, there's probably only about 3 studies in the literature where people were actually experimentally maintained on morphine. Like, so I'm gonna give you 60 milligrams of morphine every 4 to 6 hours for a week, and then I'm gonna expose you to buprenorphine and find out what happens, right? That's the test. And so those were done in the 2000s and late 90s. In all 3 studies, when people are on just straight up morphine, not methadone, not fentanyl, and morphine is a low efficacy agonist, doesn't cause the same degree of desensitization and things that fentanyl and methadone do. You find that you can wait 4 to 6 hours and introduce substantial amounts of buprenorphine, 8 milligrams IM, big doses, and they do fine. So I would say if someone is using heroin or using morphine, something like that, and they are 6 hours out and they say they're in withdrawal, it'd be perfectly fine. Now, if they've been using fentanyl for more than 2 months and they probably accumulated metabolites that are lipophilic and floating around, if they're using methadone, if they're, and again, if they're using fentanyl, they have a lot of the sensitization and these things, I'd be pretty hesitant. I would be like, that seems pretty fresh to me. Why don't we do micro-macro just to be sure? So I'm just going to place a patch. I'm going to give you, I'm going to have you swallow these small amount of pills so that you don't really bottom out. You don't get severe withdrawal. You're not going to feel great, man. But it's going to be okay. Just go home, rest, and then tomorrow morning you can take your BUP.
Great. Race asked, this might be our last question, what's the regimen for ketamine? Do you do IV or IM?
IV. So ketamine is, it's like critical care. I mean, it's a real escalation. 90% of the inductions we do are sitting in a chair with no monitor with an advanced practice practitioner. So ketamine is not for everybody. But if you're going to do it, if you've got a big abscess and you're going for it, then it's going to be IV. It's about 1 milligram per minute in initial bolus, so 15 milligrams over 15 minutes or 20 milligrams over 20 minutes. That's your initiation bolus. And then you sustain that with around 0.3 to 0.4 milligrams per kilogram over the subsequent hour. And you can run that for as long as they're kind of with you. The more, the better. And then you do your induction with buprenorphine concomitantly with that buprenorphine and with that ketamine.
Mina asks, why can't we order Sublocade in the ED?
Because it's typically an ambulatory medicine that requires prior authorization, or at least is approved for ambulatory use only. You need to establish a specific program where your hospital buys it, basically eats the cost and stocks it on formulary to avoid that. If you're lucky, you can get that. That's amazing. I don't have that.
Thank you, Andrew. Let's do the last question. If I understand right, this is from Peter, precipitated withdrawal with buprenorphine can be treated with 16 milligrams of buprenorphine and just crash the receptors. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, basically. And I really believe in the benzo thing. I'm a late comer to this. I hate benzos like a lot of emergency physicians. You just like, last thing you want to do is go down the benzo route. But it really matters, because it just basically lowers the emotional affective anxiety response to stress. And if you're in precipitated withdrawal, there's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. It's a technically, objectively stressful experience. So taking that stress level down as you're treating the opioid balance is a smart thing to do. The problem with clonidine, right, is it just screws up your exam. It'll fix the pupils and sweats and stuff like that, but they still feel terrible. So Sharon Walsh would say, it treats the numbers, but not the patient. So the tachycardia goes down, but they still feel terrible. So I've just stopped using it. I use clonidine for extremely mild withdrawal and kind of unusual circumstances.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I just want to say, I do see that last question, Megan. We'll be sure to follow up in our post-event email. But Andrew, if we can move on to the last few slides with announcements. So we just want to make sure everyone knows about our resources. We've been referring to them throughout the webinar. Our resource page has a ton of information for you all to use and take back to your sites. So definitely take your time to sit with our resource page. There's a ton of information. A lot of the information Andrew covered is on our website. So definitely go through there and definitely reach out with questions you have. Then Andrew will go to the next slide. And yes, that leads us to, please feel free to reach out to us for technical assistance. We are available for all of you when it comes to setting up MAT in your sites and giving information and our own experience. Andrew is an expert. We have so many people to also provide expertise on how to get things started at your site if you're new to MAT. We also want you to sign up for harm reduction and emergency department in nursing for our nursing training series. This is going to be in September, so a while's off, but we want, if you have nurses that are also very much interested in MAT and specifically wanting to learn about harm reduction within the ED, please consider attending and also sharing this with your site as well. This is another plug for our website as well as our social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handles are Bridge2TX. And Andrew's email is listed here, his California email, so definitely feel free to reach out to Andrew. I also want to give a verbal reminder for any of our California BHPP sites that there is a data submission deadline for July 8th. So please be on top of your data submissions by July 8th. You can reach out to me at data@cabridge.org. I'm the person who will be able to respond if you have any questions about that. But we want to make sure that is all on your radar. And then the last housekeeping thing is that we're going to be sending out an evaluation link for today's event. We encourage everyone, if you're looking for CME or want to provide feedback, to fill out that evaluation form regardless. So that's going to be in the chat, and then we'll also be sending that out in the post-event email. So with that, that is really it for today. We can stay on for a little bit longer, but thank you all so much for joining us today. We hope you all learned something and can take this with you on your journeys with MAT and inducing buprenorphine. Thank you so much, Andrew, as well.
Thanks, that was fun. All right, be in touch, everybody. Bye.